The wind carried more dust than hope across the cracked plains of West Texas in the summer of 1882. For 3 long months, the sky had refused to give rain. The earth had split open like dry leather left too long in the sun, long cracks stretching across the fields where grass once grew thick and green. Abandoned homesteads stood in the distance like ghosts, their fences fallen, their dreams blown away with the tumbleweeds that rolled endlessly across the land. Margaret Sullivan stood on the porch of her small cabin, one hand shielding her eyes from the cruel glare of the sun. The other hand gripped a metal bucket so tight her knuckles turned pale. At just 26 years old, she looked older. Grief had carved sharp lines along her face. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, streaked faintly with silver at the temples. She wore black still, though the dress had faded to gray from too many washings. 8 months had passed since Thomas Sullivan had been crushed beneath falling timber in the canyon, but Margaret refused to put color back into her life. Widowhood had not asked her permission. It had taken her husband and left her with 40 stubborn acres, 20 thin cattle, and a 4-year-old son who still asked when his father was coming home. "Mama, the chickens are acting strange again," Samuel called from the coop, his small voice carrying across the yard. "They're thirsty," Margaret replied softly, though she knew thirst was only part of it. Everything on the ranch was thirsty. The well was running lower each day. The cattle's ribs showed more clearly now. She had already buried 3 calves this season, yet each one felt like another piece of her strength slipping away. She walked toward the well, boots crunching over hard earth. The rope burned her palms as she lowered the bucket. She counted under her breath, waiting for the splash. It took too long. When she hauled the bucket back up, it was barely half full. The water was cloudy, weak, just like her chances of making the bank payment due in 2 months. That was when she heard the voice. "Mrs. Sullivan." Elijah Morse stood by her gate, thin and stiff in city clothes that did not belong in Texas dust. His smile never reached his eyes. He removed his hat politely, but there was hunger in his gaze. "The bank is reviewing accounts," he said gently. "With your husband gone, would we worry about your ability to maintain the property?" "My husband's death doesn't change my ability to work," Margaret replied, her voice calm even though fear coiled in her stomach. "Of course," Morse said smoothly. "Still, perhaps selling would be wise. A young widow alone. A small shop in town might suit you better." "This land is my son's inheritance," she answered firmly. "I will not sell." His smile tightened. "The payment is due in 2 months. I do hope you'll have it." After he left, Margaret leaned against the well and let one tear fall. Only one. She did not allow herself more. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky orange and red, she saw a rider in the distance, a dark shape moving slowly toward her ranch. Her hand went straight to the rifle resting by the porch. Strangers rarely brought good news. Yet the rider came closer. His horse limped slightly. Both looked exhausted. The man sat tall, despite his weariness, hat pulled low, shoulders broad beneath a faded blue shirt and worn leather chaps. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Evening, ma'am," he called, pushing his hat back. His eyes were pale blue, almost gray. Tired eyes that had seen too much. "Name's Jake Ryland. My horse threw a shoe 5 miles back. Was hoping I could use your tools to fix it. I'll pay or work for the trouble." Margaret studied him carefully. His gun belt was worn but clean, his posture steady. He did not look like trouble, but she had learned not to trust appearances. "There's a forge in the barn," she said finally. "Hasn't been used in a while." "I can manage," he replied. "And if there's work needs doing, I'll trade labor for a meal. I've been living on jerky too long." Samuel peeked from behind her skirts. Jake noticed and tipped his hat gently. "Fine boy you've got there." Something in the way he spoke eased a small piece of Margaret's suspicion. "Supper at sunset," she said. "Beans and cornbread." "After 3 weeks on the trail," Jake said with a faint smile. "That sounds like heaven." He worked until dark, fixing not only his horse's shoe, but also patching a broken gate and mending the chicken coop without being asked. At supper, he ate quietly, thanking her twice. When finished, he excused himself and returned to the barn without lingering. Margaret told herself he would leave in the morning. But morning came, and Jake stood at her door with hat in hand. "That roof won't last winter," he said gently. "Windmill's stuck, too. If you could use a hand a few days." "I'd work for food and barn space." She should have refused. People in town already whispered about her wearing trousers to work cattle. A strange man living in her barn would only add fuel. Yet the list of repairs grew longer every week. "I can't pay wages," she said stiffly. "Didn't ask for any." So he stayed. Days turned into a week. Then 2. Jake worked from sunrise to dark, never crossing a line, never speaking out of turn. Samuel followed him everywhere, asking endless questions. Jake answered each one with patience. When 3 men from town rode up one morning to warn her about her reputation, Jake stepped forward calmly and faced them down without raising his voice. The men left uneasy. That night, sitting by the fire after Samuel slept, Jake spoke quietly of a wife he had lost to fever, and a ranch he had sold because the memories hurt too much. "I've been drifting 5 years, he admitted. "Thought I was looking for something." Margaret stared into the flames. "Running is easier than staying," she said softly. He looked at her then, really looked at her. "You're stronger than you think, Margaret Sullivan." It was the first time he had said her name. Something shifted in the air between them. She went to bed that night, without dreaming of Thomas's broken body for the first time in months. Instead, she dreamed of pale eyes and the steady sound of hammering on her roof. And though she told herself it was foolish, dangerous even, she felt something she had buried the day her husband died begin to stir again. Hope. The drought tightened its grip on the land like a fist that refused to open. By the 3rd week of Jake's stay, the grass had turned gray and brittle beneath the cattle's hooves. The windmill groaned, but barely turned. The well gave less water each morning, and Margaret had begun rationing even their own drinking supply. One evening, Jake stood beside her at the fence line, watching the cattle gather in thin patches of shade. "We'll lose them all if we don't move them," he said quietly. Margaret crossed her arms tightly over her chest. "Clear Creek is 20 miles through Carson's Gulch. 2 days with cattle in this condition. Then we start at dawn." She looked at him sharply. "These are my cattle." "And I didn't say otherwise," he replied calmly. "But you won't drive them alone." They left before sunrise the next morning, Samuel placed safely with old Henrik Johansson. The cattle moved slow and weak, a dust rising around them in heavy clouds. Margaret rode her mare Bess. Jake handled Thomas's old gelding with natural ease. The first day drained them. The second nearly broke them. But by midday, the scent of water carried on the wind. The cattle lifted their heads and found strength they did not seem to have. When they reached Clear Creek, the animals surged forward, splashing into the shallow water. Margaret laughed with relief, a sound she had not made in months. "We made it," she breathed. Jake smiled, but his eyes scanned the horizon. "Let's not celebrate too soon." That night, they camped on higher ground. The stars stretched wide above them. The land felt less cruel here, less empty. Jake handed her a tin cup of coffee. "You handle cattle like you were born to it." "My father raised beef in Tennessee," she said. "Thomas never liked that about me. Said it wasn't fitting." "Thomas was wrong," Jake said without hesitation. She glanced at him, surprised by the firmness in his voice. Before she could respond, hoofbeats echoed through the dark. 3 riders emerged into the firelight. Bill Carver led them. Margaret recognized him at once. A hard man with a cruel mouth and eyes that looked at people like they were property. Carver smiled when he saw Jake. "Well now, Jake Ryland. Didn't expect to see you in these parts." Jake stood slowly, hand resting near his gun. "Aye, Carver." Carver's gaze slid to Margaret in a way that made her skin crawl. "This your woman?" "The lady is driving her cattle to water," Jake said evenly. "We want no trouble." Carver laughed. "Funny thing, trouble seems to follow you." One of his men made a crude remark about the cattle, another about Margaret. Jake moved so fast it barely seemed human. His gun cleared leather and fired in one smooth motion. Carver's hat flew off his head, a clean hole through the crown. "Next one goes lower," Jake said calmly. "Right away." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Carver picked up his ruined hat, face dark with fury. "This ain't over." They rode off into the night. Margaret's hands shook once the danger passed. Jake stepped closer. "You all right?" "You knew him?" "From Dodge City," Jake admitted. "And he was beating a girl in a saloon. I stopped him. He never forgave me." They took turns standing guard that night. The next evening, just as the sky began to darken, shots rang out from the rocks above. Jake tackled Margaret to the ground as bullets cracked overhead. The cattle panicked. Hooves thundered. Dust exploded into the air. Carver had returned, with more men. Jake fired back with cold precision. Margaret grabbed her rifle and shot toward the muzzle flashes in the rocks. Years of ranch life steadied her aim. The fight lasted only minutes, but it felt endless. At last, Carver cursed and ordered retreat. The riders vanished into the dark. Jake pulled Margaret into his arms, hands trembling as he checked her for wounds. "You're not hit?" "No." He held her tighter than necessary. "A damn brave woman." She could feel his heart racing against her cheek. Something changed in that moment. Not just relief, not just gratitude, something deeper. They drove the cattle home 2 days later, refreshed and stronger. But the town had already heard about Clear Creek. Whispers followed Margaret when she rode past the general store. Women turned away in church. Pastor Williams stopped visiting altogether. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Margaret spoke first. "I'm tired of pretending," she said softly. Jake looked at her. "Tired of what?" "Of acting like you're just hired help." He stood slowly, stepping closer. "Margaret." She swallowed hard. "I've been alone 8 months. I've been proper. I've worn black. I've kept my head down. But I'm 26 years old, and I am tired of being alone." The wind lifted a strand of her hair. Jake reached up and tucked it behind her ear, his touch gentle. "You know what people will say. They're already saying it." He searched her face one last time. "You sure?" Instead of answering, she rose on her toes and kissed him. The kiss began soft, uncertain. Then his arms came around her, pulling her close. The months of restraint broke like a dam. Dust and longing and quiet glances turned into something real and fierce. When they parted, breathless, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "Margaret," he whispered, "I'd trade 10 herds for one night inside you." The words were rough, raw with feeling. Not cheap, but desperate and honest. Her breath caught. "Then stay," she whispered. That night, when a storm rolled across the plains, thunder cracked. Lightning split the sky. Inside her small cabin, the widow who had thought her heart buried with her husband discovered it had only been sleeping. But morning brought ruin. The storm tore through the ranch. The barn lay shattered. The corral fence was gone. 3 cattle were dead in the gulch. Margaret stood staring at the destruction, despair heavy in her chest. Before they could begin repairs, George Dalton rode in with men at his back and Elijah Morse beside him. "This land is too much for a woman alone," Dalton said smoothly. "Sell it. Clear your debt. Leave with dignity." "I will not sell," Margaret answered. "You have 3 weeks until payment is due," Morse reminded her. 3 weeks. That night, Jake told her he would take temporary work on a cattle drive to earn money, that she did not want him to go. But he left before dawn. A week later, fire woke her in the night. The barn was burning. Margaret ran inside through smoke and heat to free the horses. A burning beam fell, trapping her in sparks and ash. Strong arms dragged her from the flames. "Jake, I saw the fire from the ridge," he said, voice shaking. "What were you thinking?" "The horses," she coughed. By sunrise, the barn was nothing but black bones. "It was set," Jake said grimly, showing her the kerosene can. "Carver." Margaret stared at the ashes. "I can't win," she whispered. Jake cupped her face, eyes fierce. "You already are. You're still standing." She leaned into him, exhausted. "Then we fight," she said. "Together," he answered. The cold came early that year. Winter rolled across West Texas like an enemy army, a sharp wind cutting through coats and into bone. Snow fell in thin, stubborn layers, covering the blackened ruins of Margaret's barn. The land looked clean under white, but she knew better. Beneath that snow were ashes, debt, and the threat of losing everything. Jake rebuilt what he could with salvaged wood. Neighbors helped quietly at night, bringing scraps of lumber and small bags of feed. Not everyone had turned their backs. Some still remembered who Margaret had been before the whispers started. But kindness did not pay the bank. 3 days before the payment was due, George Dalton rode up again. This time, he did not pretend to be friendly. He brought Bill Carver with him. Carver had a bandage on his arm from Clear Creek, but his smile was as cruel as ever. "This is your last chance," Dalton said from his saddle. "Sell the land, take my offer, or the bank takes it." Margaret stood on her porch with Jake beside her. Snow crunched under their boots. "The answer hasn't changed," she said calmly. Carver leaned forward. "Pride's expensive, widow." Jake's hand rested lightly near his gun, but he did not draw. "Ride off," he said quietly. Dalton's eyes hardened. 5 days. They rode away, but the threat stayed behind like smoke. That night, fresh hoofprints circled the ranch. Someone was watching. 2 nights later, wolves came down from the hills. Not the 2-legged kind this time. A hungry pack driven by winter. They circled the horse pen, howling in the dark. Jake and Margaret stood side by side with rifles ready. When the wolves attacked, they fought together. Jake dropped too cleanly. Margaret shot another before it could reach Bess, but one wolf lunged at her, teeth flashing white in the moonlight. She swung her rifle like a club. Jake's shot ended it inches from her throat. When silence returned, they stood shaking in the snow, breath heavy in the freezing air. "We make it to morning," Jake said. "We make it," she answered. The next day, neighbors began arriving. Henrik Johansson brought $50 in a worn leather pouch. Mary Patterson brought food. Another rancher handed Jake a small sack of coins without meeting his eyes. "It's a loan," Henrik said. "Neighbors stand together." And by sunset they had almost enough. Almost. Jake emptied his cattle drive pay onto the table. "That makes it enough," he said. Margaret stared at him. "That's yours." "It's ours," he answered. Silence filled the room. Samuel looked between them with wide eyes. Jake stepped forward, then did something that stole Margaret's breath. He dropped to one knee right there on her kitchen floor. "I don't have much," he said, voice steady but thick with emotion. "But I have my heart. I have my hands. I have my gun if anyone comes for you. I love you, Margaret Sullivan. I want to be your husband. I want to be Samuel's father. If you'll have me." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. Samuel cheered and threw his arms around Jake's neck. For the first time since Thomas died, Margaret felt not just hope, but strength. The next morning, they rode into Cedar Ridge to make the bank payment. The courthouse was full. Dalton stood near the front with 2 lawyers at his side. Carver leaned against the wall, watching like a wolf waiting for a mistake. Elijah Morse smiled thinly. "Payment in full?" Margaret stepped forward and placed the pouch on the table. "Every dollar." Before Morse could accept it, Dalton spoke. "There's a boundary issue," he said smoothly. "Federal survey shows Sullivan land encroaches on mine, including water rights." A map was unrolled. Without Clear Creek, her ranch would die. Jake's jaw tightened. "That map's false," Dalton's surveyor testified. Words like measurements and markers filled the room. Margaret's hands trembled. Then Henrik stood. "The stone markers along Clear Creek were real," he said firmly. "No, I helped place them with Army surveyors years ago." "Where are they now?" Dalton's lawyer asked. "Dug up," Henrik replied. "Recently." Murmurs spread. Pastor Williams rose slowly from his bench. "I heard Mr. Carver bragging about moving stones near Clear Creek," he said, voice shaking but clear. The room erupted. Carver swore. Dalton shouted. The judge slammed his gavel. "Until proven otherwise," the judge declared. "The original boundaries stand. The bank will accept payment." Margaret's knees nearly gave out. Dalton stormed from the courthouse. Carver shot Jake a look that promised revenge. But that revenge never came. 2 weeks later, word spread that Bill Carver had been caught robbing a bank in Colorado. He had killed a deputy during his escape. This time, he would hang. The shadow over their lives lifted at last. Spring followed winter like forgiveness after judgment. Rain returned to the land. Real rain. The prairie turned green again. Clear Creek ran strong and full. Cattle grew sleek. The ranch breathed like a living thing brought back from death. On a warm April afternoon, under a simple arch of wildflowers, Margaret married Jake. She wore her mother's ivory dress. Samuel stood proudly beside Jake, holding the rings. Pastor Williams spoke the vows carefully. Jake's hands trembled when he said, "I, Jake Ryland, take you, Margaret Sullivan, to be my lawfully wedded wife." Margaret's voice was steady. "I promise to stand beside you against all who would harm this family, in drought and in plenty." When Jake kissed her, the small gathering of neighbors cheered. Later, as the sun set in deep orange and gold, and Margaret noticed a rider at the far edge of the property, George Dalton. He watched the celebration in silence. Then he turned his horse and rode away. He had lost. Not just the land. The war. That night, when the guests were gone and Samuel slept peacefully in his bed, Margaret stood with Jake on the porch. The air smelled of rain and fresh grass. He wrapped his arms around her from behind. "You ever regret not selling?" he asked softly. She looked out at the land she had nearly lost, the rebuilt barn, the grazing cattle, the life they had fought for. "Never." He leaned close, brushing his lips against her ear. "I'd still trade 10 herds for one night with you." She laughed, the sound bright and free. "Good thing you don't have to," she replied. You've got me for every night. Forever, forever." Under the endless Texas sky, where drought had once cracked the earth and men had tried to break her spirit, Margaret Sullivan stood strong. She had buried a husband, faced down greed, survived fire and gunshots, and found love again. Not the soft kind that comes easy, the hard kind, the kind built in storms. And this time, she would never stand alone again.